The Forum at 8 on SAFM.
6.5 minutes after 8. A very good morning indeed, and a warm welcome to the Forum at 8 here on SAFM, South Africa's news and information leader. Well, this morning, as we've been saying throughout the morning, South Africa's ranking with Transparency International has dropped, suggesting that corruption is getting worse in this country. The country, you may remember this, in 2010 was ranked in the 54th position, but now it has dropped about 10 places, ranked 64th on the world rankings. The rankings, of course, refer to the annual Transparency Corruption Perception Index, which they say is a useful measure of whether corruption is getting worse or better in 102 countries worldwide. Let's talk a little bit about this then and what we are doing as a country in order to deal with these matters. Let me welcome here in our studios David Lewis, Executive Director of Corruption Watch. Good morning, David. Thanks again. Thanks indeed for joining us. We're hoping to go to Sea Point a little later on to talk to Dr. Daryl Balia as well, Head of Corruption and Governance Program at the Institute for Security Studies, still trying to connect with our studios there. But let me stick with you, David. Are you surprised that there's this kind of a ranking 10 places worse off than where we were 10 years ago? I beg your pardon, 2 years ago, actually.
Not really. We've been in this activity for a short time, and quite clearly this is a perceptions index, and quite clearly from the communications on our various platforms indicate that the perception and indeed the reality of corruption is something that is really, really prevalent. The reality is prevalent, and so the perceptions are not, it seems to me, at all unwarranted.
Let's talk a little bit about that. Let's talk a little bit about the perception versus reality, because corruption by its very nature is something that's done, in the darkness and so on. It's very difficult to measure, is it not?
It is. It's difficult to measure, and it's sometimes difficult to define precisely what the boundaries of corruption are. And so, perceptions indexes are useful, and comparative perceptions indices are useful, but they're not the end of the matter. And I think that we've got to draw our conclusions from concrete evidence, and the concrete evidence seems strong. I mean, whatever it is, people in this country are very worried about corruption. They're very worried about the incidence of corruption. And that, to me, is good enough reason for thinking about it and working out how to combat it, almost regardless of what the international comparative surveys and indices say. But they are useful to know whether we're getting better or we're getting worse relative to other countries. We may be standing still and the others may be getting better, or we may be getting worse while the other countries are standing still. That's not always clear, but they are useful, and they are very mediagenic. They, I think, strike people as measures of how we're doing.
In your experience as Corruption Watch, in the short, 5 months ever since you were launched?
4 months.
4 months.
Yeah.
In terms of empirical evidence, though, are you finding that there's a lot of evidence that we're getting deeper and deeper in this malaise?
We're getting lots of reports. I mean, I think we've now had about 3,000 reports on our various media platforms, not all of which are corruption related, but we're getting lots of reports, and we're starting to see, although the data is still at an early stage, we're starting to see interesting patterns, geographic patterns of conduct. We're getting an enormous amount of complaints, for example, about small towns and small municipalities, which I find really interesting because they often don't make the headlines of the big national newspapers. So yes, the evidence is strong. I also think, and this is an interesting comment on the perceptions of corruption, is that corruption has become something of a sort of metaphor for any unfair treatment. So you do get reports of stuff that is not corruption, but that is grossly unfair. And it's interesting that people should see unfair treatment as equated to corruption in some way or another. It's not always, but it tells you what people think about the extent and state of corruption in the country.
Sure. You know what? Let me bring in Dr. Daryl Balia, Head of Corruption and Governance Program at the Institute of Security Studies from our Seapoint Studios. A very good morning to you, Dr. Balia. Thank you for your time this morning.
Good morning.
Thanks indeed. Your thoughts then on the latest Transparency International's ranking of South Africa. Are you surprised?
No, not at all. I think the perception, we need to be clear that this is a perceptions index. You spoke a few minutes earlier about empirical evidence, and I think, as you correctly observed, corruption is not something that can be clinically or scientifically measured. So the most you can deal with here is an approximation to what is actually happening on the ground. And so we talk about perceptions, and you try to measure that, and that's what this index is doing. I think, part of our problem in this country is that whenever we talk corruption, it seems to always be somebody else's corruption and not one's own. So we need, some kind of national ownership of the problem. Corruption implicates, a lot of us, whether we're in the public sector or in the private sector. I think that point has to be made. I think we also have to recognize that corruption is something that has infested succeeding generations of humankind the world over. It's not a peculiar, African problem. In recent years, one seems to get a sense here that when people say, corruption, they're actually talking about maladministration or anything, anything that the government does which does not work, and it seems to be equated to corruption. So I think we need to be a bit clinical in terms of what we mean and not use the term too loosely. I think it's also important for us to recognize that corruption is always two-sided. There's the corruptor and the corruptee. And with this, the Corruption Perceptions Index, we should be clear that, bribery is not the emphasis there. It is more a reflection of, public sector corruption in terms of interviews conducted with a number of business people, etc. So it is a bit one-sided. I think if you look at the bribery side, there is a case to be made for a lot of the corruption, emanating from outside of South Africa.
Sure.
But I think that said, Kolani, the concern I have about this index is that what is happening now, over against recent years, South Africa has slipped very badly compared to other African countries. We have Namibia, we have Botswana, we have Mauritius, and the Cape Verde, who have a higher rating than we do, and that is a problem for us, on the continent of Africa.
And that is why then we should ask these questions. What are the problem areas, do you think, Dr. Balia? Do you think that perhaps we don't have adequate national legislation to deal with this?
Well, no. I really think we need to just hold back there, because whenever the problem of corruption rears its ugly head anywhere in the world, people rush to write up laws, and we have some of the most avant-garde global conventions now. But the problem seems to exacerbate itself. I think in South Africa we have a problem now in terms of perception with the entire procurement process. Whenever there's a contract out that is issued by government, it seems as if it invites the buying and selling of influence. So we have to find creative ways of dealing with this perception that government contracts are for sale depending on where one stands in terms of the buying and selling of influence. So for that reason, we have been advocating for quite some time now for the use of integrity pacts, where you engage in a pre-bidding process and you declare your credentials up front. You agree to a process of full transparency where all extra payments, or shall we call it commissions or whatever whatever that nature may be, all those kinds of of issues of payments are put on the table, where the bidders know one another and they bind themselves to an agreement. And should they fail to honor those agreements or end up paying bribes or something of that sort, they will lose the contract or they will face penalties,
Yeah.
We need to find creative ways of dealing with this perception that government contracts, can be bought depending on one's level of influence.
But the argument, and perhaps I can bring you in here again, David, because the argument goes, it's a lot more than just procurement, the tender processes. The Public Service Commission reported on this just a couple of months ago, reporting such things as bribery, fraud, traffic officials, and you did something here with the JMPD, Johannesburg Metro Police, on issues of traffic officials soliciting bribes from motorists and officials receiving kickbacks and so on. It's widespread.
No, it is, and I think often something like nepotism, for example, irregularity in appointments, I think is a platform on which a huge amount of corruption is based. I said to you earlier that we are receiving a lot of reports of corruption in small towns.
Yeah.
I think that's largely it's largely rooted in how appointments are made and what the payback is for getting a good appointment in a juicy little Free State dorpy that allows you to cream off the top of a budget. And there are grey areas of political connectedness, if you like, that gives you a privilege and gives certain companies or individuals privilege in accessing contracts, sometimes that are not strictly illegal, but are not conduct becoming public administration. And those areas have got to be looked at as well.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to that issue then, and perhaps just go back to Dr. Balia here on the issue of small dorpies now starting to report that perhaps that's where the difference is between South Africa and other countries across the continent, where the reporting mechanisms are there, and that there are institutions that even the so-called little men can use to report corruption, and hence then we are seen to be more corrupt than other African countries.
Yes, I think that is a matter of serious concern. I think at a practical level, we need to ask ourselves, is the merit system under threat in South Africa, well, in the public service at least? And I would say very much so. I think if you talk about a government job, if you talk to ordinary members of the public, they will say, well, it depends on who you know. So I think the entire merit system needs to be protected as it is. It has come under severe threat. I mean, the question is, should government be spending these enormous amounts of money, advertising jobs, in the public service, especially at the higher level, when most of the appointments are being made, by the ruling party, for example? I mean, a DG, it's almost impossible for a DG, to advertise, I think, for a position that's, without having access, to relevant structures, and if the minister has the the decision in his hands. So the question is, should we not look at a process where the politicians are able to be more transparent or more upfront about how they wish to make appointments, rather than simply spending money advertising a position?
But what does that do to corruption? It doesn't stop corruption necessarily.
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't stop corruption, but I'm saying we need to just be more transparent about how we make appointments. If it's going to be a political process, let's just have a different way of doing this, rather than spending money, advertising a post and people not applying because they know it's going to be a political appointment anyway. Let me give you another example. If you want a passport, say, in a week, it's almost impossible to do that. But there are many people who will tell you that they've paid bribes to get that passport in a week. Now, I'm asking the question, shouldn't we have a system where you pay a fee, and where, that fee accrues to the state? Let's pay extra to get the passport in a shorter space of time, but let the fee, accrue to the state, to the taxpayer, shall we say, rather than to the the official who receives the bribe. So, to use the term, loosely, legalize the loophole. There are many such instances, I think, even at the local level, where we need to build in a fee structure so that people who, somebody who wants a fishing permit, they can get it, sooner rather than later.
Okay.
And do it legally rather than having to pay a bribe.
All right. What we will also do here, by the way, is open the lines on 0891 104 208, 0891 104 208. I'm really interested in finding out from your observation, then, if you've been monitoring issues around corruption, where are the loopholes? Why is it that we are getting as worse as, of course, some of the surveys are saying we are? What are some of the problems? What are the problem areas that you can identify, and how do we deal with those problem areas? 0891 104 208. Also, send us an email this morning if you want to go that particular route, gwalax@sabc.co.za, gwalax@sabc.co.za. Let's take a commercial break. When I come back, of course, one of the things is I'm going to ask David, about initiatives such as whistleblowing initiatives in this country. Are they not bearing any fruit? And if not, why? It's 21 minutes after 8.
The Forum at 8 on SAFM.
Right, 23 minutes after 8, we're talking corruption. What are some of the problems and how do we deal with these issues? David, we're talking about these matters, particularly in the small door piece.
Yeah, well, we are getting complaints, for example, which suggest there happen to be a hell of a lot of complaints from small Free State towns. And a lot of them concern what the people who are writing to us believe to be a nepotism or irregularity in appointments of town managers. You're not talking about places with, budgets the size of the arms deal. These are relatively small budgets, but they're enough to make a single individual and the cronies that he inevitably appoints to his positions relatively rich very, very quickly. And other people see this. And the attitude, I imagine, is either to say, well, if you can't beat them, join them.
Sure.
Or, as I think we're seeing increasingly, what are euphemistically called service delivery protests, which is basically resentment at the fact that services in the form of a huge extraction of rents from the local budget seem to be going to a select few people and not to the communities whom they're intended to serve. And so this takes the form of a service delivery protest, which, as Daryl points out, may reflect a failed program, which I'm sure happens everywhere and in every country, or it may reflect corruption that starts with a bad appointment, an irregularity in an appointment.
Because these irregular appointments perhaps go to the heart of what Dr. Balia was talking about as well, where he talks about procurement processes and some of the problems arising out of that, because people then assume that you have appointed this manager so that you can get certain tenders, certain deals, and again, it just recurring accusations of you appointed your own manager so that you can give that kind of a person the tenders.
No, I think that's right. I mean, where the tender system is concerned, I can't believe that we can't tighten up our tender processes a lot. My understanding about tender processes, and I may be wrong, I'd be interested to know what the listeners think, is that we have an unusually fragmented and fractured tender process. I think that there needs to be, and I don't doubt that in institutions like the Treasury, a lot of attention is being given to this stuff. We need to think about tender processes that are relatively immunized from the decision-making of a large range of people and boards. I mean, we're also investigating the possibility of taking civil action against people who sit on tender boards and either take decisions in bad faith or fall asleep on the job and don't do their job properly. And we think if members of people who are responsible for issuing tenders start to realize that they can be held individually liable for what they are doing, this may concentrate their minds somewhat. But I can't believe that we can't fix up the tender process a little better than we're doing. The problem that I'm talking about of nepotism in the appointment of heads of public administrations, even of small towns, is somewhat different, but it definitely feeds into poor allocation of government work and government tenders.
Let me take Charles in Cape Town. Charles, good morning.
Morning, Colin, and you guys.
Hi.
My take, I want to mention this corruption watch. I don't know if they bias or, as if all their targeting and all their energy is put in, okay, fine, you're targeting government, but like, for example, this issue of the tender, the SCARA's tender in Cape Town, there's no exposure and their urgency to get into that. I want to know from your guest there. Have they got information? Have a whistleblower given them information? Because it's a serious, allegation, and it's been sent to the seller. But now you have Zille basically going and basically intimidating her, and then the next thing you hear, it's turned around. I mean,
Right.
that to the public, I mean, it's corruption, blatant corruption, but now it's been turned around. No, they've been vindicated.
All right,
The other
Charles
thing
in
is
Cape Town.
on the tenders, Kolani, the process. The problem is government is getting consultants to look at the tender process. Like, for example, in soil engineering, CIDB system. That system replaced a previous system. That was so-called, incorruptible. But now, so the problem is that it actually so-called protected in the sense that once the adjudication is made, it's made by the client.
Yeah.
The client sort of have the final say. Now, according to your gentleman, he hasn't got a clear idea, but he's trying to put forward information that he's not clear on. And how can you get someone like that that hasn't done his homework and you want to speak about the corruption? I think he
All right.
needs to get first the facts straight.
All right. Well, of course, you'll get your response coming through. Charles in Cape Town, thank you. Quickly, though, let's talk to Mr. Mkhize. Mr. Mkhize is the Deputy Director General at the Department of Home Affairs, and Home Affairs has obviously seen its fair share of complaints about corruption. But Mkhize, good morning.
Good morning, Polani, and good morning to your listeners.
Thanks for your call. Yes.
No, Polani, I just heard one of your callers or one of your guest speakers there talking about making a transport as an example of corruption. And I think it's an unfair accusation that when people run short of examples, more often than not, while we are doing everything we can to fight corruption, we become the whipping department all the time. I can assure you that, Polani, the issue of the passport and fighting corruption there, we implemented what we call life capture system, where a person must be there. Two, we introduced what we call a biometric log-on system to deal with corruption. Now, there are people only on exceptional circumstances who will come and they've already paid an air ticket. There is an emergency, someone is life-threatening situation like what happened at Doha, for example, where someone lost their family and they had to rush there. We then have a facility where we are able to say maybe this passport must be captured and be dealt with quickly. It's not that people are then using corruption or bribery to do that because there is a process. And thirdly, the Minister, Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, was requested by BUSA, Business Unity South Africa, to consider this suggestion that was given about charging the tariff that is higher for agent passports. And we are finalizing that tariff issue.
Okay.
So that then at the end of the day, people who say they want a passport, but it must jump that it is agent, we should be able to issue that because we have that capability. But we were setting up processes that will be able to do that in a more legal way. So it's not that people are doing that because it's through corruption.
All right.
We do have our fair share of troubles, but it's really unfair that we then being used as a whipping all the time.
All right.
as a department.
That's the DDG of Home Affairs. I thank you for calling us this morning and, of course, putting forward the side of your department story. What we'll do is we'll take the news headlines now because it is 8:30. When we come back, my guest again will respond to some of the issues that we've heard so far. But I would like you to call us again on 0891 104 208. What are your thoughts on these issues? 0891 104 208. I'll also be reading for you some of the emails that we've received at gwala@sabc.co.za. It is 24 minutes before 9. We're talking corruption. We're talking about how can we put a stop to corruption. Clearly, some of the survey findings, Transparency International suggesting that corruption problem getting worse in this nation. And we wanted to know from your point of view then, what is it that should be done? What is it that is not being done correctly? Let me read some emails, some SMSs. I'll look at the emails, then bring in my guests here. Toons, it says, corrupt people are selfish and only think of themselves. Another one says, our rating will worsen as long as the majority won't punish corruption at the elections ballot. For the majority, corruption is not an election issue. That's an SMS that came through a while ago. Another one says, the ANC's arms deal scam and Jacob Zuma avoiding his corruption charges sets the worst possible example. No wonder corruption is rife. That's Hunts in the Western Cape. We have an email as well that says, the government sells corruption bronze, silver. silver and gold introduction to ministers from 5,000 to 100,000 per introduction to the industry endorsed by Cabinet. That's Mike. Also an SMS that says to register a company at CIPRO takes about 6 weeks and 1 day from the guys on the street. That's why people are doing what they're doing. Tsidi says, ask your guest if it is proper for a premier, or rather for premier's advisors, to be part of a tender adjudication process. These are some of the SMSs I'll look at more in a minute, but let me just also read one or two emails. There's an email from Mampe that says, I just want to raise a concern about what one of your guests has said about Home Affairs. There has been a great improvement in the department, and one can get a passport in 3 days without paying a bribe. From personal experience, I'm not working for the department, I'm just a citizen. That's Mampe. I guess same concern that was raised by I beg your pardon, the Deputy Director General, or Mr. Mkhize. Another email says, in job appointments area, I think applicants should at least be written a letter of regret that will also explain the reasons of not being appointed or not shortlisted at all. That way people would believe that the particular human resource department have gone through their CVs than just keeping quiet. Then we think, yeah, nepotism. They already had their man for the job. That's Carol on email. David, before I go to the lines, your responses to my callers before the news headlines, but also some of the SMSs and emails.
Yeah, just to take the Home Affairs issue first, which Daryl had used as an example, I agree with the callers. I think, and so do the people reporting to on our communications platforms, that Home Affairs in the issuing of passports and identity documents has improved enormously. And in fact, I really wish, and we have on our board a former Director General of Home Affairs who I think was in significant part responsible for many of these changes. I wish that story could be told. It would be really worthwhile knowing how they did it, because I think it's a successful instance of a turnaround. The one set of complaints we are getting about Home Affairs is around immigration issues. It seems that immigrants or potential immigrants are not being treated as well as South Africans are being treated by Home Affairs. But certainly where South Africans are applying for passports and IDs, there's been a significant improvement, both in efficiency and in the lack of in a reduction in corruption.
But you see, there's something very interesting about that, because one of the things that happens when there's an improvement in service is officials make themselves available. Here this morning, a complaint about passport, the official calls and says, hey, this is the story. Where officials are available and are able to share information, things improve.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. And we're getting responses from officials on our communications platforms, which are great. They don't speak to systemic improvements. Sometimes they just tell you there are actually some good cops out there and there's some good officials out there, and we want to hear those stories as well. But in the Home Affairs story with IDs and passports, you get the idea that there's been a really systemic improvement, and it would be good for those who led that systemic improvement to explain and to tell that story, because I think that there are plenty of other public institutions that could learn something from that.
This is a typical from zero to hero type story.
Yeah. But I mean, it's not on an individual basis. I mean, this seems to be on an institutional basis, and without making too much of it, I think that Baba Mkhize and the other caller are right about but as I say, where immigrants are concerned, they're not getting such a great deal from Home Affairs.
Dr. Balia will probably have something to say about this as well, but let me just quickly take some calls here. A number of people have been on the line for a while. Or maybe do you want to comment quickly, Dr. Balia?
Yeah, no. I think I kind of agree with with what Dave has been saying. And in fact, it's good that I used Home Affairs as an example, because I was really referring to the days when they used to receive, these, their audits were not, quite in shape. So I think things have improved tremendously there, over the past year or so. So, hats off to them for the work that they are doing. But we had a caller earlier who spoke about 6 weeks, the 6 weeks wait to register a company, and that creating a window of opportunity, for corruption. So, it is those kind of spaces that need to be blocked. So, if you bring in some kind of a system where the permits, or the registration can can take place sooner, at a higher fee perhaps, then, that kind of, I think, the important thing I'm saying here is that we need to reduce the opportunities for corruption. So the other thing, I think one of the callers earlier spoke about Western Cape.
Yeah.
Now, the situation here is that the public protector has, in some sense, cleared the province of corruption, but I think we should be very clear that for something to be corrupt, it doesn't have to be illegal. So you can still have corruption in the place of in the process of legal things happening. So things don't have to be illegal for them to be corrupt. That's the bottom line here. So in the Western Cape, we know that there were some minutes, to give you one example, that were not kept about certain meetings. So, you could conclude that the concealing of information by not keeping minutes is an act of preventing transparency from taking place, and that can be seen as an act of corruption.
All right, let me take some calls then, starting with John in Durban. Hello, John.
Thanks. I first want to echo the thing about Home Affairs. On the ground, the change has been remarkable, even to the point of little touches like adding seats the same as SARS, etc. Fantastic. I think the new whipping boy is the Department of Public Works. With regards to Charles about the Cape, if there was any proof, believe me, the ANC wouldn't have let any stone unturned to try and divert attention from their own corruption. The main thing, the only way to stop corruption, how many officials have we had charged with corruption of millions of rands that are resigned? They're not followed up because it said that it costs 10 million rand to try and prosecute them for the million rand. But let me tell you something. I will gladly pay an additional 50% tax to make sure that these guys are nailed to the wall. Because only when they have a criminal charge and they cannot go back to a different department or a different province a year later and be given a job and then have the cheek in the newspapers to say, I was not charged with anything. Therefore, I'm entitled to this job of millions of rands.
Sure.
We have to charge them criminally and have this idiots locked up.
All right, John, thank you very much. But also, just for my guests, when they respond to John, it's quite important what he's saying, because there was that Public Service Commission report which found that despite strong stands taken around these matters by authorities, but only 35% of cases reported to the National Anti-Corruption Hotline and referred to the national and provincial departments were finalized. The issue is that, as John is saying, that perhaps officials are not dealt with accordingly. Only 28% of cases lodged with the Independent Police Investigative Directorate since 2004 have been finalized, and only 41% of those brought to the South African Police Services. Perhaps just to back up what John was saying there a short while ago. Let's quickly go to Tabiso. Good morning to you, Tabiso.
Hi, Colin. How are you, my brother?
I'm very well. Thanks for your call.
Colin, the line, between business and politics, shouldn't be as thin as it is right now. You know what I'm saying? Unfortunately, Colin, the president also said that it shouldn't be a problem, for a politician to have business, And then, that if one is a politician and you and me are bidding for a tender, politician always has an advantage over us, So for me, I think that was not encouraging at all, because, we cannot have a situation whereby only cadre, membership, so to speak, there can be the overriding criteria, to offer South African opportunities, for employment and other things, Because in South Africa, if you are not known politically, you are doomed, You can be as educated as you can. I was touched by a show that I saw. It's Kotane, something that is happening in the East Rand, where kids were saying that they don't want to be like, they see graduates, who are moving around the streets being unemployed, and then they don't want to be like that, because one even make an example of a person who move around the streets of that township with degrees, They don't want to be like that. They want to be like people who are entrepreneurs, people who are driving big cars, and people who don't have very little education. And what do? They have an impact, on on the development of South Africans.
Sure.
Corruption in South Africa, Cloran, is beginning to have as damaging impact as apartheid,
Okay.
And if it is not tackled properly, we are doomed, There must be a clear line between politics and business. If a person wants to be a politician, they must know that they are there to serve the people.
Okay.
And the business must be left to business people, Cloran.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Tabiso in Soweto, I thank you very much. Let's go to Peter in Grahamstown. Hello, Peter.
Thanks very much for taking my call.
Hi,
Kalani,
Peter
this
Wilde,
is a
yeah.
very brief call to appeal to you to hold your guests and callers to account. I'll give you an example. The caller just before 8:30 made two rather serious comments. He said that Helen Zille intimidated the public protector to influence her decision. He also said that everybody knows that there was corruption in the Western Cape. Now, this is tantamount to creating or maintaining a pseudo-issue, as was written about in her letter of the 8th of April, where she wrote about this refugee issue. The following letter on the 1st of June, titled Storm in a Teacup, goes into detail about this so-called corruption in the Western Cape. Now, to suggest that she can intimidate the public protector is actually a very serious thing, and you should get her back on radio to protect herself.
All right, but Charles is not alone in
He went on to
this.
say that
Peter?
everybody knows that there's corruption in the Western Cape, which is not true.
All right, Peter, but okay, David, you want to respond?
Yeah, I think it's been acknowledged in that Western Cape issue, which incidentally, Charles, we did publicise on our website, that there were irregularities in that process. My understanding is that even the Premier has acknowledged that her advisors should not have had any role to play in that adjudication process. So here you have an example of something that may not have been strictly illegal, but there were conflicting interests that should have been out in the open. So I think that and I think a very aggressive stance was taken with respect to the public protector, to be perfectly honest. So we're about public resources. Whoever abuses them, whatever political party, whatever members of a political party or political administration abuses them, or indeed if the private sector abuses them.
I just want to ask you, maybe David, you can respond as well to what Tabiso was saying, because he in the end says corruption in this country is almost doing what apartheid was doing. I mean, that's...
Well, I don't know. I mean, who puts problems on poverty? Is poverty more serious than corruption? I think it is, but I don't think that kind of thing is particularly helpful. But I think that Tabiso really hit the nail on the head when he says that it's the very, very badly blurred lines between business and government that is responsible for a lot of what corruption is about. I really agree with him that line should be made very much clearer. I mean, it seems to me very often that people in the public sector and elected officials think that they can be involved in both business and government, that simply by declaring an interest, they somehow that conflict disappears. It doesn't disappear. It's simply declared. And I think that this is a debate that we really need to be having very much more strongly. Public servants in this country are not poorly paid, and I don't see why it is necessary to carry on active involvement in business, particularly when the business is doing business with the public sector institution of which you're part. And then there are greyer areas like the families of politicians or families of public sector leaders. This is something that really needs to be cleaned out.
Dr. Bali, do you want to come and comment on that? Tabiso's one and John's one, because there's this issue also that those who have committed these acts must be seen to be punished.
Yes. The thing is, in South Africa, we have one of the most sophisticated pieces of legislation, to prevent corruption. But if you look at the number of prosecutions successful ones that we've been able to obtain under that legislation, they're very few. So having laws in place doesn't solve our problem. And I think the due process that's involved in securing a prosecution under the act, the Prevention of Corruption Act, I think it's very, very technical, and it's very expensive, to employ, hundreds of investigators. I mean, as necessary as it may be, but we have to look, at the costs of fighting corruption. This is a thing that we don't often talk about. We say zero tolerance. But if we have to have a policy of zero tolerance to stop corruption, it's going to cost us, a lot. And there are no budgetary lines, as far as I'm aware, that National Treasury uses, to fight corruption. So we need to think very creatively about putting resources out there, to fight corruption if we are going to stop it at all.
Is there an issue of resources, David?
Yes, I mean there are always resource issues. I think zero tolerance is the right approach to take, but that doesn't really mean that we'll ever eliminate corruption. And I think that corruption, and I would say this, I guess, is not only about official resources devoted to policing and investigation and prosecution. It's also about involving citizens in participating actively in both reporting corruption and expressing their views on corruption, to make those in elective office, those in public service, aware that if they continue involving themselves in corrupt activities, or even in turning a blind eye to the corrupt activities of their colleagues or people that they know, that this would be a costly career choice to make.
Right. I have a couple of calls that I'm going to go through now. Also read your emails and SMSs that coming through in a couple of minutes' time.
The Forum at 8 on SAFM.
Some emails for you. There's Thabo Likhoje who says, it's so amazing that big companies like Accenture and Ernst & Young are always involved in the big failing projects and they are never implicated. For example, the Home Affairs project with Gijima. Accenture was involved but never implicated. These big corporations do favors to the government and never wait for the tender to be advertised. Your visitor is right. This waste of money of the government following procedure does not only affect the taxpayer, even me, the person organizing documentation to contest the tender. The government is following small fishes to keep, to keep us busy while they dine with the big ones. That's Thabo on email. Stan Lee also has sent us an email this morning. Private sector is seriously corrupt in this country. However, a perception is created that only government is involved by the media. Can you bring into the discussion the private sector, the corruptors? Stan Litlizio says. My guest will respond to you in a second there, Stan. Another one from Kusta Echini. Do not underestimate the immense corruption or contribution of the Eastern Cape to such corruption levels. How on earth would you explain the lobbying by Bisho Admin to host AFCON tournament when they could barely afford to pay health workers? Kusta Echini. Another one from Adrian von Senger. He says, regarding corruption, as long as the government policy towards corruption is 1, instant promotion with increase in pay, 2, what you have stolen is yours and nobody can ask you to return anything, 3, bring on the info bill so that the public will not be allowed to know about corruption, then I see no hope of improvement. That's Adrian on email. Another email came through from Ron in Hillcrest, who says, a big problem is that the role models in corruption are set at the top. We have a president who evaded the courts through a political solution. He has a spokesperson who has unresolved cloud over his head. Did not the chairperson of the ANC try to obtain a driver's license through suspect means? This and much more send messages down the ranks that corruption is okay. That's according to an email from Ron in Hillcrest. Let me quickly go to Sig in Randburg, who's on the line. Sig, good morning.
Oh, thank you, Kulani. I'm so glad that you just read this last thing about our former speaker and chairman of the ANC and the president. That's exactly my feelings too. What worries me is that not the speed cops that take bribes and the municipalities, which are virtually all deeply corrupt. What worries me is that we have abundant proof of corruption at the highest levels of law enforcement. And I'm so glad. I wanted to congratulate Mr. David Lewis for taking a direct interest in the case of General Richard Ndluli, our head of crime intelligence, because the abandonment of his charges of murder, 10 years he's escaped. He got away with murder for 10 years and fraud and corruption. This is abundant proof of corruption at the highest level, and he was reinstated several times in spite of this record which stands there. And what's more, the prosecutor, the honest public prosecutor who was after his blood, Glynis Breitenbach, was suspended by that by the authorities in charge of our National Prosecuting Authority, which are violating the Constitution. Thank you very much.
All right, that's Sigyn Randberg. Mr. Lewis, perhaps you may want to respond to that and kind of wrap up for me as well. I'm also quite interested in I know we spoke about it after 7 o'clock this morning, but also just following up on this issue of General Mdluli. What will you be doing as Corruption Watch?
Well, in the Mdluli case, we're making an application together with the Social Justice Coalition to intervene in the application brought by Freedom Under Law to compel the prosecuting authority to reintroduce charges against Mdluli for allegations of murder and corruption. And we're applying to join that matter because we think we bring a particular perspective to the case, and because as an institution dedicated to combating corruption, we acknowledge absolutely clearly and we understand absolutely clearly that you have to have a police force that at the highest levels is untainted by any charge of corruption or partiality. And we think that these allegations against a very senior policeman, particularly one involved in crime intelligence, have to be investigated. You know, as part of a wrap-up, I mean, I guess to make the point that we're interested in, and I must make this point again and again, we're interested in public resources, whoever abuses them. And the Stan is absolutely right that it is often at the instance of the private sector that public resources are abused, and sometimes not only the private sector in South Africa, but international companies as well. And we're as interested in them as we are in public sector people who abuse corruption. And I guess to say finally that yes, corruption is very serious and corruption is on the increase, but I'm quite encouraged by the extent of public outcry around the issue of corruption and the response there has been to our initiative. So I think that people are starting to take this all in hand.
And your closing remarks for me here, Dr. Bali?
Well, I think this started off as a debate about public sector corruption, because that's what the Corruption Perceptions Index is really about. But I was saying that corruption is always viewed as somebody else's problem. I think we need a sense of national ownership of the problem and not be pointing fingers simply at government, because business, it takes two hands to clap, as they say. So, business has got to take responsibility. The private sector, some people say that the corruption in tax revenues alone, account for more than all the foreign aid that comes into Africa. And that's really, something worth thinking about. So if it is true, I think we all have very important roles to play, to deal with this problem and bring about a reduction in corruption, and not just to point fingers at one particular sector.
All right. I really thank you both for coming through and talking to us this morning. David Lewis, Executive Director of Corruption Watch. Thanks indeed. And, of course, from our Seapoint studios, Dr. Daryl Balia, Head of Corruption and Governance Program at the Institute of Security Studies. I thank the team as well who put it all together for us this day. Our producers, Mesho Shandlale and Wisane Makubele. Technical producer, President Machaya. Senior producers, Lungile Mabaso and Chili Titibase. Forum at 8 producer, Jake Mugoma. Chief producer, Butsi Lukoto. Executive producers, Obro Sechie and Busi Chanam. Olanu Gwala will be back again for you 6 to 9 tomorrow here on SAFM, South Africa's news and information leader. It's time now for Morning Talk. 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 For Morning Talk.